In the scorching summer of 1894, in the dusty border town of Laredo, Texas, two elderly Mexican women walked into Dr. Harrison Webb's medical office and shattered everything the American medical community thought they knew about human longevity. Esperanza and Consuelo Valdez were 74 years old, identical twins who had lived through the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, countless cholera epidemics, and the violent chaos of the Texas frontier. Yet they stood before Dr. Webb with the posture of women decades younger, clear eyes that seemed to pierce through his soul, steady hands unmarked by arthritis, and not a single gray hair between them. What Dr. Webb discovered in his examination would haunt him for the rest of his life, and what the medical community uncovered about these women's past would remain buried in classified government files for over a century. The truth about the Valdez sisters wasn't just medically impossible, it was morally unthinkable. Before we continue with the story of the Valdez sisters, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, and tell us in the comments what state you're listening from, because this mystery spans across the entire American Southwest, and what we're about to reveal will make you question everything you thought you knew about the limits of human knowledge. The mystery of Esperanza and Consuelo Valdez began long before that fateful day in Dr. Webb's office, in a place that may no longer exist on any map, where the line between healing and horror became forever blurred. Laredo in 1894 was a town caught between two worlds, a place where the dying echoes of the Old West met the advancing march of modern civilization. The dusty streets buzzed with the polyglot mix of Spanish and English, the clash of Mexican tradition and American expansion, creating a unique frontier culture. Railroad workers with calloused hands and sun-weathered faces shared saloons with cattle ranchers whose fortunes rose and fell with the unpredictable Texas weather. Merchants hawked their wares alongside desperados who viewed the border as a convenient escape route from justice on either side of the Rio Grande. Life in this border town was hard and often brutally short. Cholera outbreaks swept through the poorest neighborhoods with terrifying regularity, claiming entire families in a matter of days. Violence was an everyday reality. Gunfights over card games, knife fights over perceived slights, and the constant threat of bandits who viewed the railroad as a source of easy money. Industrial accidents at the rail yards and ranching mishaps added their own toll to the grim statistics. The brutal Texas heat, which could reach 110 degrees in the shade during summer months, claimed lives through heat stroke and dehydration. The average life expectancy in Laredo barely reached 45 years, and those who lived to see 50 were considered fortunate survivors. Dr. Harrison Webb had arrived in Laredo 3 years earlier, a Harvard-educated physician armed with the latest medical knowledge and an unshakable faith in the power of scientific progress. At 38, he was considered one of the most qualified doctors between San Antonio and the Rio Grande. His diploma from one of America's most prestigious medical schools lending him credibility among the town's growing American population. Webb had come to the frontier not for adventure or fortune, but from a genuine desire to bring modern medicine to places that desperately needed it. Webb prided himself on his scientific approach and meticulous record-keeping, documenting every case in detailed journals that he hoped would someday contribute to medical knowledge. His office, located on the main street in a two-story building that also housed the town's only pharmacy, was equipped with the latest medical instruments he could acquire: a microscope, surgical tools sterilized according to the newest theories about infection, and a small library of medical textbooks that he consulted regularly. The doctor had seen everything the frontier could throw at him: gunshot wounds that required delicate surgery under primitive conditions, knife fights that left men scarred for life, mysterious fevers that defied identification, difficult births where both mother and child hung between life and death. He had watched strong men succumb to diseases that should have been survivable, and he had seen the weak somehow find the strength to overcome seemingly impossible odds. But nothing in his extensive education or 3 years of frontier experience had prepared him for what he would encounter with the Valdez sisters. The twins had lived quietly on the outskirts of Laredo for over 20 years, in a modest adobe house that sat on 5 acres of carefully maintained land. The property was surrounded by gardens that seemed to defy the harsh Texas climate, growing plants that had no business thriving in such arid conditions. Neighbors knew them as curanderas, traditional healers who sold herbs and remedies to the Mexican community that made up the majority of Laredo's population. The sisters kept largely to themselves, venturing into town only when necessary to purchase supplies or attend to patients who were too ill to travel to their home. They spoke little English, conducting most of their business in rapid Spanish that even native speakers sometimes found difficult to follow. Their dialect contained words and phrases that seemed ancient, remnants of a linguistic tradition that predated the arrival of Europeans in the New World. What struck everyone who encountered the Valdez sisters was their remarkable preservation. While other women their age had long since died or become bent and frail, victims of the hard frontier life, Esperanza and Consuelo moved with surprising grace. Their faces bore few lines, their dark hair remained thick and lustrous without a trace of gray, and their eyes held a clarity that seemed almost unnatural in people who claimed to have lived through 7 decades of hardship. Local folklore whispered that the sisters possessed secrets passed down through generations, ancient knowledge that allowed them to maintain their youth and health far beyond normal human limits. Some claimed they had learned their healing arts from indigenous shamans in the deep mountains of Mexico. Others insisted they were descended from Spanish conquistadors who had discovered the fountain of youth in their explorations of the New World. The more practical residents of Laredo simply assumed the sisters had good genetics and knew how to take care of themselves. But folklore and practical assumptions meant little to Dr. Webb. He was a man of science, skeptical of superstition and traditional remedies that couldn't be explained through rational analysis. He had seen too many patients suffer because they trusted folk healers instead of seeking proper medical treatment. In his mind, the curanderas represented everything that was wrong with frontier medicine: ignorance disguised as wisdom, superstition masquerading as knowledge. That skepticism would soon be tested in ways he never imagined, as the Valdez sisters forced him to confront the possibility that some knowledge existed outside the boundaries of his scientific understanding. The morning of July 23, 1894, started like any other oppressive summer day in Dr. Webb's clinic. The heat had already settled over Laredo like a suffocating blanket, and the doctor was reviewing patient files when the relative quiet of his office was shattered by urgent pounding on his door. Before he could respond, the door burst open and Maria Santos stumbled inside, her face streaked with tears and her clothing disheveled from running through the dusty streets. The young Mexican woman was hysterical, speaking rapidly in Spanish while gesturing frantically toward the door. Webb's Spanish was limited, but he caught enough words to understand that something was terribly wrong with her infant son. The child had been burning with fever for 3 days, and traditional remedies had failed to bring relief. "Doctor, please," Maria managed in broken English, her voice cracking with desperation. "My baby, he's dying. Las curanderas, they say come to you now. They say only you can help. They say they cannot save him." The fact that the local curanderas were sending a patient to him was unusual enough to get Webb's immediate attention. In his 3 years in Laredo, the traditional healers had never acknowledged his existence, let alone referred patients to him. They viewed him as an outsider, an interloper who threatened their authority in the community. For them to admit defeat and seek his help suggested that this case was beyond their considerable skills. Webb immediately gathered his medical bag, checking to ensure he had everything he might need for a pediatric emergency. He followed Maria through the winding dirt streets of Laredo's Mexican quarter, past adobe houses that seemed to absorb and radiate the brutal heat, past cantinas where men sought refuge from the sun in the shadows and cheap alcohol, past markets where vendors hawked their wares under makeshift canvas awnings. The Santos home was a small shack on the very edge of town, its walls made of rough timber and its roof a patchwork of tin and tar paper. A crowd had gathered outside, neighbors, family members, and curious onlookers drawn by the drama of life and death. The mood was somber, with women crossing themselves and men removing their hats as Webb approached. It was clear that everyone expected the worst. Inside the sweltering shack, Webb found a scene that would remain etched in his memory forever. The infant lay motionless on a rough wooden table that had been covered with a clean white sheet. The child's tiny body was gray and lifeless, his skin already beginning to take on the waxy appearance that comes shortly after death. But what truly shocked Webb was not the dead child. He had seen infant mortality too many times in his career. But the two women standing on either side of the table like sentinels, Esperanza and Consuelo Valdez, stood in perfect symmetry, their hands folded at their waists, their heads bowed at identical angles. Webb had seen the sisters from a distance during his 3 years in Laredo, but never up close and never in circumstances like these. What struck him immediately was not just their remarkable preservation for women of their advanced age, but something deeply unsettling in their demeanor. They moved in perfect synchronization, their heads turning toward him at precisely the same angle, their dark eyes fixing on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. There was something predatory in their gaze, as if they were evaluating him rather than simply acknowledging his presence. Their faces showed no emotion, no sadness for the dead child, no sympathy for the grieving mother, no acknowledgement of their own failure to save a life. "The child passed moments ago," Esperanza said, in accented but surprisingly clear English, her voice steady and completely emotionless. "We did everything we could. We administered every remedy in our knowledge," Consuelo added, her tone so identical to her sister's that for a moment Webb wondered if he was hearing an echo. "Sometimes even our gifts are not enough." Webb approached the table and began his examination of the infant, following the procedures he had learned at Harvard for determining cause of death. The child showed all the signs of typhoid fever, the wasting, the dehydration, the particular pallor that came with that specific disease. But something nagged at him as he worked. The body was positioned too perfectly, the limbs arranged with a clinical precision that seemed unnatural for a child who had died in agony. Moreover, the sisters' complete lack of emotion seemed strange for women who had supposedly been fighting to save a life. In his experience, even the most professional medical practitioners showed some sign of distress when they lost a patient, especially when that patient was an infant. But Esperanza and Consuelo displayed the detached interest of scientists observing the results of an experiment. As Webb filled out the death certificate, trying to focus on his work despite the oppressive heat and the weight of the family's grief, he noticed something that made his hand pause mid-sentence. Both sisters bore identical small scars on their left hands. 3 parallel lines that looked deliberately made, almost ritualistic in their precision. The scars were old, well-healed, but their placement was too exact to be accidental. When he glanced up from his paperwork, he found both sisters watching him with expressions he couldn't quite read. There was something calculating in their gaze, as if they were measuring his reaction to what he had observed. For a brief moment, Webb felt like a specimen under a microscope, and the sensation was deeply uncomfortable. "Doctor," Esperanza said, her voice cutting through the murmur of grieving family members, "perhaps you would like to examine us sometime. We have lived long lives in this harsh place. Your science might be interested in how we have managed to survive when so many others have not." The way she said "science" sent a chill down Webb's spine despite the oppressive heat. There was something mocking in her tone, as if she knew secrets that his education had never taught him. The invitation was phrased politely, but it felt more like a challenge than a request. "We know things," Consuelo added, her eyes never leaving Webb's face, "that your books do not teach. Things that might expand your understanding of what the human body can endure and what it can accomplish." Webb found himself nodding agreement, though every instinct told him to decline and walk away. His curiosity as a physician overrode his growing unease, even as alarm bells rang in the back of his mind. 3 days later, the sisters appeared at his clinic for what would become the most disturbing medical examination of his career. The appointment was scheduled for late afternoon, when the heat had begun to dissipate, and the streets of Laredo grew quiet in preparation for the evening. Webb had spent the intervening days thinking about the sisters, their unusual preservation, and the strange circumstances surrounding the Santos child's death. He had even consulted his medical textbooks, looking for any mention of traditional healing practices that might explain their apparent longevity. When Esperanza and Consuelo arrived at his clinic, they came dressed in simple black dresses that seemed more appropriate for mourning than for a medical examination. They moved with the same synchronized precision he had observed at the Santos home, and once again Webb was struck by their unnatural preservation. Up close, in the better light of his office, he could see that their skin had the texture and elasticity of women decades younger than their claimed age. "We are ready for your examination, doctor," Esperanza said as they seated themselves in his office. "We are curious to see what your modern science will make of us." As Webb prepared his instruments, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to discover something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about medicine, aging, and the limits of human capability. Webb's examination of the Valdez sisters defied every medical principle he had learned during his years at Harvard Medical School. Their vital signs were not just good for women of their advanced age, they were remarkable by any standard. Their resting heart rate was that of trained athletes, strong and steady at 60 beats per minute. Their blood pressure was perfect, their lung capacity impressive, and their reflexes, while not superhuman, were remarkably sharp for people who claimed to have lived through 7 decades of frontier hardship. What truly puzzled Webb was their muscle tone. Both sisters showed evidence of lives filled with physical activity, their bodies lean and strong despite their advanced age. Yet neighbors insisted they rarely left their property except for brief trips into town. Their hands, which should have been gnarled with arthritis after decades of manual labor, were steady and dexterous. When Webb tested their grip strength, he found it comparable to that of women half their age. Most disturbing were their scars. Beyond the 3 parallel lines he had noticed on their left hands, both sisters bore dozens of small, precise marks covering their arms, torso, and even their legs. The scars were clearly intentional, made with surgical precision and perfectly healed. They formed patterns that seemed almost anatomical, as if someone had been using their bodies as textbooks to teach human physiology. "Where did you acquire these markings?" Webb asked, trying to maintain his professional composure while examining a particularly intricate pattern of scars on Esperanza's forearm. The sisters exchanged a glance, a quick, almost imperceptible communication that lasted only a fraction of a second, but seemed to convey volumes of information between them. It was Esperanza who finally spoke. "We come from the mountains, Doctor, far from here, in a place where civilization had not yet reached. Our people had traditions, ways of learning that your schools do not teach." "What kind of traditions require such precise cutting?" Webb pressed, his scientific curiosity overcoming his growing unease. "Traditions that keep one healthy," Consuelo replied, her voice as emotionless as her sister's. "Traditions that teach survival, when survival means the difference between life and death. In the mountains, one must understand the body completely, how it works, how it fails, how it can be repaired." Webb tried to press for more details, but the sisters offered only vague references to their homeland. They claimed to come from a remote mountain community that they said no longer existed, destroyed by the violence that had swept through northern Mexico during the wars of the mid-1800s. They spoke of their former home in terms that were both nostalgic and ominous, referring to it as a place where ancient knowledge had been preserved and taught to those worthy of learning. Over the following weeks, Webb found himself consumed by thoughts of the Valdez sisters. He measured their lung capacity using the latest spirometry equipment he had ordered from Boston. He tested their reflexes with increasingly complex procedures. He even analyzed samples of their blood under his microscope, searching for any clue that might explain their remarkable preservation. Everything he discovered only deepened the mystery. Their blood showed no signs of the diseases that typically affected people their age. Under microscopic examination, their cells appeared healthier and more robust than those of patients decades younger. Their bone density, as far as he could determine without X-ray equipment, which wouldn't be invented for another year, seemed remarkably strong. Word of Webb's findings began to spread through the small but growing medical community of South Texas. By autumn of 1894, physicians from San Antonio, Austin, and even Dallas had begun making the journey to Laredo to examine the mysterious sisters for themselves. Each examination only confirmed Webb's initial findings and added new puzzles to the growing mystery. Dr. Margaret Chen was among the first to arrive. One of the few female physicians practicing in Texas, Dr. Chen had built her reputation on her willingness to investigate cases that other doctors dismissed as impossible or irrelevant. She was particularly interested in traditional healing practices, having studied various folk medicine traditions throughout the Southwest during her medical training. Dr. Webb, she confided after conducting her own thorough examination of the sisters, "I've studied traditional medicine throughout the Southwest and northern Mexico. I've interviewed indigenous healers, Spanish colonial curanderos, and even practitioners of African healing traditions brought by escaped slaves. I've never encountered techniques that could preserve health to this degree. These women know things that aren't taught in any medical school I'm aware of." But it was Dr. Chen who first noticed something Webb had missed during his initial examinations. She observed the sisters' breathing patterns during stress tests, noting how they seemed able to control their heart rate and blood pressure through concentration alone. More disturbing was their encyclopedic knowledge of human anatomy. They could identify pressure points and nerve clusters with the precision of trained surgeons, and they seemed to understand the body's systems in ways that went far beyond traditional folk medicine. "Tell me, Doctor," Chen asked the sisters during one of her examinations, "where exactly did you learn such detailed knowledge of human physiology? Some of what you've described is more advanced than what we teach in medical school." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time since Webb had met them, the sisters appeared genuinely uncomfortable. They shifted slightly in their chairs, and their synchronized movements became less precise, as if Dr. Chen's question had disrupted some carefully maintained facade. Esperanza finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "One learns many things when survival depends on it, Doctor. When your people face threats that civilized places do not know, you must understand everything about life and death. Everything." "What kind of threats?" Dr. Chen pressed, her scientific curiosity overriding her growing sense of unease. Instead of answering directly, Consuelo rolled up her sleeve further, revealing more of the intricate scars that covered her arm. "Each mark tells a story, Doctor. Each mark represents knowledge gained through experience, knowledge that cannot be learned from books or lectures." That evening, Dr. Chen pulled Webb aside with a discovery that would change the entire direction of their investigation. While researching territorial records in the courthouse basement, she had found scattered references to a remote mountain settlement called Refugio de las Hermanas, Refuge of the Sisters. The settlement had supposedly existed in the rugged mountains of northern Mexico, but all official references to it stopped abruptly in 1847. "Dr. Webb," Chen said, her voice tense with excitement and apprehension, "I think we need to investigate this further. I found mentions of this place in 3 different sources: a Catholic Church record, a Mexican military report, and a territorial survey from 1845. But then nothing. It's as if the place simply vanished from history. The records, Dr. Chen had discovered painted a picture of a thriving religious community that had existed for nearly 2 decades in the Sierra Madre Mountains. According to the church documents, Refugio de las Hermanas had been established in the early 1830s as a Catholic mission dedicated to preserving indigenous healing traditions while converting local populations to Christianity. "The strange thing," Chen continued, "is that all the records emphasize the remarkable health and longevity of the settlement's inhabitants. They're described as having virtually no disease, no infant mortality, and lifespans that far exceeded the regional average. The Catholic Church was apparently very interested in studying their methods. But what truly caught Webb's attention was a detail buried in one of the military reports. The document, written by a Mexican army captain in 1846, mentioned two young women who served as the settlement's primary healers. The captain described them as twins, possessed of unnatural knowledge of the body's secrets, and skills in both healing and harming that defied explanation. "Dr. Webb," Chen said quietly, "I think we may have found where our sisters learned their skills. But I also think something terrible happened at that settlement, something that forced them to flee and hide their true knowledge. And I'm beginning to suspect that what happened there might explain not just their longevity, but their unusual attitudes toward death." The investigation that followed would consume both doctors' lives for the next several months, as they delved deeper into the mystery of Refugio de las Hermanas and its connection to the women who had somehow survived its destruction. The investigation that Dr. Chen and Dr. Webb launched into the history of Refugio de las Hermanas quickly revealed disturbing patterns that neither physician was prepared to confront. Working together with methodical precision, they began documenting everything they could discover about the Valdez sisters, their daily routines, their interactions with patients, their extensive knowledge of both healing and harmful plants, and most importantly, their past. What emerged from weeks of careful research was a picture that grew more unsettling with each revelation. The sisters' knowledge of medicinal plants was not just encyclopedic. It extended far beyond healing into realms that made both doctors increasingly uncomfortable. During seemingly casual conversations, the women could identify dozens of toxic plants and describe their effects on the human body with chilling precision and disturbing enthusiasm. When Dr. Chen tested their knowledge by asking about the symptoms of various plant-based poisons, their answers were immediate, detailed, and spoken with the confidence that comes only from direct observation. They could describe the progression of ricin poisoning, the specific neurological effects of certain mushroom toxins, and the cardiovascular collapse caused by digitalis overdose with the precision of researchers who had watched these effects unfold in real time. The oleander, Esperanza had explained during one such conversation, causes the heart to beat irregularly before it stops entirely. The victim experiences nausea and confusion first, then cardiac arrhythmia. Death usually occurs within 12 to 24 hours, depending on the dose and the victim's constitution. The castor bean is more gradual, Consuelo had added with what Webb could only describe as clinical satisfaction. The ricin damages the cells slowly. The victim seems to recover at first, then deteriorates over several days. It mimics many natural diseases, making it difficult to detect. More troubling were the inconsistencies in their personal history that became apparent under scrutiny. The sisters claimed to have arrived in Laredo in 1873, but property records showed they had purchased their land in 1871, a discrepancy of 2 years that might seem minor, but became significant when compared to other irregularities in their story. When pressed about these inconsistencies, the sisters simply stated that paperwork often contained errors, especially during the chaotic period following the Civil War. But Webb was beginning to suspect that the errors were intentional, part of a carefully constructed false identity designed to obscure their true origins and timeline. Dr. Samuel Rivera joined the investigation in late October 1894, bringing with him expertise in the emerging field of forensic medicine. A colleague of Webb's from their Harvard days, Rivera had spent the years since graduation studying criminal investigation techniques and the medical analysis of suspicious deaths. His arrival would prove crucial to understanding the true nature of the Valdez sisters' knowledge. Rivera's examination of the sisters' scars was conducted with the meticulous attention to detail of a criminal investigator. Using a magnifying glass and careful measurements, he documented the precise locations, angles, and healing patterns of every mark on their bodies. His conclusions were disturbing and unambiguous. These aren't ceremonial markings or accident scars, Rivera told Webb and Chen privately after completing his examination. They're practice cuts. Someone taught these women anatomy by having them make precise incisions on themselves and each other. Look at the patterns. They follow major blood vessels, nerve pathways, and organ locations with surgical precision. Rivera's analysis revealed that the scars formed a comprehensive anatomical atlas carved into human flesh. There were marks indicating the locations of major arteries, the pathways of important nerves, and the precise positions of vital organs. Most disturbing were the patterns on their hands and wrists, which Rivera identified as practice cuts for techniques used to disable or kill quickly and quietly. Whoever taught them this, Rivera continued, his voice grim with the implications of his discovery, wasn't just interested in healing. They were training these women to understand exactly how to damage the human body as efficiently as they could repair it. The team's investigation expanded to include interviews with longtime residents of Laredo, searching for anyone who could provide information about the sisters' arrival and early years in the community. What they discovered was a pattern of coincidences that strained credibility and painted an increasingly sinister picture of the women's true nature. Several elderly residents recalled that mysterious deaths had occurred shortly after the sisters' arrival in the early 1870s, deaths that were attributed to natural causes but shared curious similarities. The victims were always people who had asked questions about the sisters' background, expressed skepticism about their healing methods, or shown interest in investigating their past more thoroughly. Maria Esperanza Ruiz, an elderly woman who had known the sisters for nearly 20 years, finally broke her silence when Dr. Chen offered to treat her severe arthritis free of charge. Speaking in rapid Spanish, which Dr. Chen translated for Webb and Rivera, Maria revealed information that sent chills through all three physicians. She says, Chen whispered as she translated the old woman's words, that people who asked too many questions about the sisters' past had a habit of falling ill with strange sicknesses. Always different symptoms, but always fatal. She says the sisters never seemed surprised when these deaths occurred, almost as if they had been expecting them. Maria's account was corroborated by other long-time residents who, once assured of anonymity, shared similar observations. A pattern emerged of curious neighbors, nosy officials, and persistent questioners who had died under mysterious circumstances over the past 2 decades. The deaths were always attributed to common frontier ailments, fever, heart failure, respiratory illness, but the timing was consistently suspicious. Most chilling was Maria's description of the sisters' behavior during these deaths. Unlike other residents who showed normal grief and concern when neighbors died, Esperanza and Consuelo displayed what Maria called científica frialdad, scientific coldness. They would attend funerals and offer condolences, but their demeanor suggested professional interest rather than personal sorrow. She says, Chen continued translating, that the sisters would always volunteer to help prepare the bodies for burial. They insisted on washing and dressing the deceased, claiming it was their duty as healers. But Maria noticed that they seemed to be examining the bodies very carefully, as if they were studying the results of their work. The implications of this revelation forced the 3 physicians to confront a possibility that challenged their understanding of medicine and morality. Were the Valdez sisters not just healers who had learned their trade through unconventional means, but active practitioners of a deadly art that combined medicine with murder? Dr. Rivera's expertise in criminal investigation led him to examine the official death records for Laredo and the surrounding area over the past 20 years. What he discovered provided statistical evidence for what Maria Ruiz and other residents had observed anecdotally. The mortality rate among people who had expressed interest in the sisters' background was significantly higher than the general population, and the causes of death showed patterns consistent with sophisticated poisoning. The deaths appear natural, Rivera explained to his colleagues, but they cluster around specific behaviors, asking questions about the sisters' past. expressing skepticism about their methods, or attempting to investigate their background. The statistical probability of this being coincidental is virtually zero. As winter approached, the three physicians found themselves facing a moral and professional dilemma that none of their medical training had prepared them to handle. They possessed evidence that two respected members of the community were likely responsible for multiple murders committed over a 20-year period. But the evidence was circumstantial, and the sisters' methods were so sophisticated that proving criminal activity would be nearly impossible using the forensic techniques available in 1894. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Laredo intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because what the medical team uncovered about the sisters' true past would shake the very foundations of their understanding of human nature. Winter of 1894 brought an unexpected opportunity for deeper investigation when Professor Edmund Hartley arrived in Laredo as part of his research into indigenous cultures of northern Mexico. A distinguished anthropologist from the University of Chicago, Hartley had spent the better part of a decade traveling throughout the Southwest, documenting the customs, beliefs, and historical traditions of various ethnic groups in the region. When Dr. Webb shared his team's findings about the Valdez sisters, Hartley's extensive knowledge of regional history proved invaluable. The professor's personal journals contained references to dozens of remote communities, religious settlements, and isolated groups that had existed throughout northern Mexico during the turbulent mid-1800s. Refugio de las Hermanas, Hartley mused, consulting his extensive notes while seated in Webb's office on a cold December evening. I've heard whispers of this place during my travels through Chihuahua and Coahuila. The local indigenous people speak of it in hushed tones, calling it El lugar donde murió la paz, the place where peace died. Hartley's research had uncovered fragments of a story that was far more disturbing than anything the medical team had imagined. According to oral traditions he had collected from various sources throughout northern Mexico, Refugio de las Hermanas had been established in the early 1830s as a religious commune led by a charismatic Catholic priest who preached the importance of isolation from what he called the corrupted outside world. The settlement had initially thrived, becoming known throughout the region for its remarkable agricultural success and the extraordinary health and longevity of its inhabitants. Travelers' accounts from the 1830s and early 1840s described a community where disease was virtually unknown, where even the elderly maintained their strength and vitality, and where the knowledge of healing seemed to exceed anything found in the civilized world. But Hartley's research revealed that something had gone terribly wrong during the winter of 1846-47, coinciding with the Mexican-American War. Official Mexican Army records, which Hartley had uncovered during his research in Mexico City archives the previous year, contained brief but disturbing references to a military expedition sent to investigate reports of violence and disappearances at the settlement. The official report, Hartley explained to Webb, Chen, and Rivera as he shared his findings, states that the settlement appeared to have been evacuated hastily. The buildings were intact, personal belongings were left behind, and there were signs of recent habitation, but no people were found alive. However, Hartley had also discovered unofficial accounts, letters that soldiers had written to their families, personal diaries that had never been submitted to official military records, and testimony given years later by veterans of the expedition. These sources told a very different and much more horrifying story. According to these unofficial accounts, Hartley continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, the soldiers found evidence of systematic violence throughout the settlement. They described finding bloodstains that suggested dozens of deaths, personal belongings scattered as if people had fled in terror, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be some kind of ritual chamber where they discovered carefully arranged human bones. The expedition's unofficial findings suggested that Refugio de las Hermanas had not been evacuated. It had been the site of a massacre. but the evidence indicated that this had not been an attack by outside forces. The violence appeared to have come from within the community itself, as if the residents had turned on each other in some kind of systematic slaughter. "What makes this directly relevant to your investigation?" Hartley said, leaning forward with obvious excitement and apprehension, "is what one soldier wrote about the survivors. According to his letter to his wife, the expedition found evidence that a small group had escaped into the mountains before whatever happened at the settlement occurred. The letter specifically mentions twin girls who knew the healing arts and the killing arts with equal skill. The pieces were beginning to form a horrifying picture that challenged everything the medical team thought they understood about the Valdez sisters." Webb felt his stomach lurch as he realized the implications of Hartley's research. If the professor's information was accurate, then Esperanza and Consuelo were not just survivors of some distant tragedy. They were potentially witnesses to, or even participants in, mass murder. Webb arranged for a private meeting with the sisters under the pretext of conducting follow-up medical examinations. But this time, he came prepared with specific questions about Refugio de las Hermanas and armed with the knowledge that Hartley's research had provided. The sisters arrived at his clinic on a cold January evening in 1895, dressed in their usual simple black clothing and moving with their characteristic synchronized precision. But Webb noticed immediately that something was different about their demeanor. They seemed more alert, more cautious, as if they sensed that the nature of their relationship with the medical community had changed. "We understand you have been asking questions about our past, Doctor," Esperanza said as they settled into chairs in Webb's office. "Questions that go beyond medical curiosity. Knowledge has a way of spreading," Consuelo added, her dark eyes fixed intently on Webb's face. "Sometimes that knowledge brings understanding. Sometimes it brings danger." Webb felt his heart rate increase as he realized that the sisters were aware of his investigation. They knew that he and his colleagues had been researching their background, and their calm acknowledgement of this fact was somehow more terrifying than if they had seemed surprised or defensive. "I'm a scientist," Webb replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. "It's my nature to ask questions when I encounter something I don't understand. Your longevity, your knowledge, your remarkable health. These things fascinate me from a medical perspective." "And what have your questions revealed, Doctor?" Esperanza asked, tilting her head at an angle that somehow made her appear predatory despite her advanced age. Webb decided that directness was his only option. "They've revealed references to a place called Refugio de las Hermanas, a settlement in the mountains of northern Mexico that apparently no longer exists." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time since Webb had known them, the sisters' composed facade showed cracks. Esperanza's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her cup of tea, and Consuelo's eyes darted toward the door as if calculating an escape route. "You have been asking dangerous questions, Doctor," Esperanza said slowly, her voice carrying a warning that made Webb's skin crawl. "Questions that disturb graves that are better left undisturbed." "Sometimes graves need to be disturbed," Webb replied, surprised by his own boldness, especially when they might explain how two women survived something that apparently killed an entire community. The silence stretched between them like a physical presence, heavy with unspoken threats and terrible possibilities. Finally, Consuelo spoke, her voice barely audible above the winter wind rattling the windows of Webb's office. "Survival, Doctor, sometimes requires choices that civilized people cannot understand. Our people face threats that your books do not describe, enemies that your safe world has never known. We learned what we needed to learn to survive." "What kind of threats required you to learn such detailed knowledge of human anatomy?" Webb pressed, his scientific curiosity overriding his growing fear. What enemies necessitated understanding both healing and harming with such precision? Instead of answering directly, Esperanza slowly rolled up her sleeve, revealing more of the precise scars that covered her arm. In the lamplight of Webb's office, the marks seemed to form intricate patterns, anatomical diagrams carved into human flesh with surgical precision. "Each mark tells a story, Doctor," she said, her voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. "Each mark represents knowledge gained through direct experience. Knowledge of how the body works, how it breaks, how it heals, and how it dies." Webb stared at the scars, realizing with growing horror that they weren't random markings. They formed a comprehensive map of human anatomy, the locations of major arteries, the pathways of critical nerves, the positions of vital organs. Someone had taught these women medicine by using their own bodies as textbooks, creating a living library of anatomical knowledge. "Who taught you this?" he whispered, unable to look away from the intricate network of deliberately inflicted wounds. The sisters exchanged another glance, and for a moment, Webb saw something in their eyes that made his blood freeze. It wasn't fear or sadness or even defiance. It was the cold calculation of predators who had been discovered, but were not yet ready to flee. "Father Sebastian," Consuelo finally answered, her voice filled with a mixture of reverence and something that might have been fear. "He taught us everything we know about the secrets of life and death." The name Father Sebastian sent Professor Hartley into a frenzy of research that would consume the next several weeks. Working with contacts he had developed throughout Mexico during his anthropological studies, Hartley began uncovering records that painted a picture of a man whose definition of religious devotion had crossed the line into absolute madness. Sebastian Valdez. Webb noted with growing dread that the sisters shared his surname, suggesting a family connection that made their story even more disturbing. Had been a Catholic priest who was expelled from the church in 1834 for what official records described as theological irregularities and disturbing practices that violated the sacred trust between shepherd and flock. The detailed church records that Hartley obtained through his contacts in Mexico City described Father Sebastian as a brilliant but increasingly unstable individual who had developed his own twisted interpretation of Christian doctrine. His theology emphasized suffering as the primary path to divine knowledge, and he believed that understanding the human body in its entirety, including its capacity for pain and its mechanisms of death, was essential to truly comprehending God's creation. "Dr. Webb," Hartley said, his voice shaking as he read from the church documents in Webb's office. Father Sebastian wasn't just teaching religion to his followers, he was conducting systematic experiments on human beings. The church investigation found evidence that he was using his own congregation as subjects for anatomical studies, medical experiments, and what can only be described as torture disguised as religious instruction. The full scope of Father Sebastian's activities became clear through painstaking research that combined church records, Mexican military archives, and oral traditions that Hartley had collected throughout northern Mexico. The priest had established Refugio de las Hermanas as a place where he could pursue his perverted studies without interference from church authorities or civil government. Father Sebastian had selected a group of children from among his most devoted followers, including twin girls who would eventually become Esperanza and Consuelo, for what he called advanced theological education. Under the guise of religious instruction, he had taught them subjects that no children should ever learn. Advanced human anatomy, surgical techniques, the properties of various plants and minerals, and most disturbing of all, methods for causing untraceable death. The priest's curriculum had included lessons in what he called the sacred mysteries of the flesh. Students were required to study anatomy by making precise cuts on their own bodies and observing the results. They learned the effects of various poisons by administering them to animals and documenting the progression of symptoms. Most horrifying of all, they practiced surgical techniques on living subjects, initially animals, but eventually, according to testimonies that survived in fragmentary form, on human volunteers from among the commune's most fanatical adherents. The commune thrived because Father Sebastian had created a population of individuals with advanced medical knowledge. Webb realized as he pieced together the timeline with his colleagues, they could keep the community healthy because they understood the human body better than trained physicians. But that same knowledge had a sinister application. When dissent arose within the commune, when members began to question Father Sebastian's increasingly extreme demands, or when outsiders showed too much interest in the settlement's activities, the priest's specially trained students knew exactly how to eliminate these problems. They could induce heart attacks that appeared natural, create respiratory failures that mimicked common diseases, or administer poisons that left no trace in the primitive forensic examinations of the 1840s. Dr. Chen, who had been researching similar religious communes throughout Mexico and the American Southwest, uncovered the final piece of the puzzle that explained what had happened during the winter of 1846-47. A journal fragment, discovered in a private collection in Mexico City, had been written by a Mexican army captain who had participated in the expedition to investigate Refugio de las Hermanas. The captain's account, written years after the events and clearly intended as a confession rather than an official report, described finding evidence of what he called medicinal murders throughout the settlement. Bodies had been discovered buried in carefully organized graves, each showing signs of death that appeared natural but revealed subtle evidence of poisoning or surgical intervention when examined closely. Most chilling was the captain's description of the ritual chamber that other sources had mentioned. According to his account, the room contained detailed anatomical drawings covering every surface, along with what appeared to be a systematic record of human experimentation spanning more than a decade. The bones found in the chamber showed signs of precise cuts and intentional damage, evidence of someone practicing increasingly advanced surgical techniques on living subjects. The twins weren't just survivors of whatever happened at Refugio de las Hermanas, Chen concluded grimly as she shared her findings with the rest of the team. They were Father Sebastian's most successful students. He had trained them to be healers and killers in equal measure, and they had spent years perfecting their skills on their fellow commune members. But the investigation revealed that the story didn't end with the commune's destruction. Father Sebastian had apparently anticipated the Mexican military expedition, perhaps through contacts he maintained within the church or government circles. He had orchestrated the systematic elimination of the entire commune, using his specially trained students to murder every resident before fleeing into the mountains with his most devoted followers. The massacre hadn't been the result of external attack or internal uprising. It had been a carefully planned operation designed to eliminate witnesses and evidence of Father Sebastian's experiments. The priest and his remaining followers, including the twin sisters, had spent the next 25 years wandering through northern Mexico and the American Southwest, always staying ahead of authorities and always leaving a trail of unexplained deaths in their wake. They weren't refugees seeking a new life, Webb realized with growing horror. They were predators looking for new hunting grounds. And they chose Laredo because it was the perfect environment for their particular skills. The border town offered everything the surviving members of Father Sebastian's cult needed. A population that trusted traditional healers, minimal law enforcement, poor communication with outside authorities, and a constant flow of travelers and transients whose disappearances wouldn't be investigated thoroughly. As curanderas, the sisters could practice their legitimate medical knowledge openly while using their darker abilities to eliminate anyone who grew too curious about their past. Dr. Rivera's forensic analysis of the death records confirmed what the team's research had suggested. Over 20 years in Laredo, at least 30 people had died under suspicious circumstances after expressing interest in the sisters' background or questioning their methods. The deaths had been spaced out over time and attributed to various natural causes, but the pattern was unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Webb realized with growing terror that he himself was now in mortal danger. His investigation had uncovered too much, asked too many questions, penetrated too deeply into secrets that had been hidden for nearly 50 years. As he sat in his office reviewing his notes on the evening of March 15, 1895, he made a decision that would save his life. Instead of confronting the sisters directly or attempting to gather more evidence, he quietly copied all his research and distributed it to colleagues throughout Texas, and beyond. He wrote detailed letters to Dr. Chen, Professor Hartley, Dr. Rivera, and medical colleagues in San Antonio, Austin, Dallas, and even Boston, explaining his fears and asking them to contact federal authorities immediately if anything happened to him. He also prepared a comprehensive report detailing everything the team had discovered about the Valdez sisters, Father Sebastian, and the Refugio de las Hermanas commune. Copies of this report were sent to the Texas Rangers, federal marshals, and even officials in Mexico who might be interested in closing a case that had remained unsolved for nearly 50 years. It was a prescient decision that demonstrated the analytical thinking that had made Webb a successful physician. The next morning he woke feeling violently ill, with symptoms that perfectly matched several of the mysterious deaths he had investigated over the past year. But this time, the sisters had made a crucial mistake. By targeting someone who had prepared for exactly this possibility, they had triggered a response that would finally bring their decades-long killing spree to an end. Dr. Webb's sudden illness mobilized his colleagues with unprecedented speed and coordination. Dr. Chen received his letter by telegraph and immediately departed San Antonio for Laredo, bringing with her a federal marshal and a military physician who specialized in treating exotic poisonings. Professor Hartley, meanwhile, had already contacted Mexican authorities with his research about Father Sebastian and the Refugio de las Hermanas commune, setting in motion an international investigation that had been waiting nearly 50 years for resolution. The federal investigation that followed was swift, thorough, and conducted with the kind of resources that local law enforcement could never have brought to bear on the case. When U.S. Marshals arrived at the Valdez sisters' adobe house on the morning of March 18, 1895, they found it meticulously cleaned and completely abandoned. The sisters had vanished sometime during the night, leaving behind only their carefully tended garden of medicinal plants. Federal botanists who examined the garden made disturbing discoveries that confirmed the team's worst suspicions. Many of the plants growing on the property were highly toxic varieties that didn't naturally occur in South Texas. Someone had been cultivating deadly nightshade, castor beans, oleander, and dozens of other poisonous species with the care and precision of a master gardener. The arrangement of the plants suggested systematic cultivation for the purpose of poison production rather than legitimate medical use. Hidden beneath the floorboards of the main house, investigators discovered a cache of documents that provided definitive proof of everything Webb and his colleagues had theorized. Father Sebastian's personal journal, written in a mixture of Spanish and Latin, contained detailed records of his experiments spanning more than 4 decades. The journal was a masterpiece of meticulous record-keeping and absolute moral corruption. It contained anatomical drawings that rivaled anything produced by legitimate medical schools, detailed descriptions of poison recipes that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of chemistry and toxicology, and most damning of all, a chronological list of over 400 names with dates of death and methods used. The entries revealed the true scope of Father Sebastian's criminal enterprise. The commune at Refugio de las Hermanas had been just the beginning of a killing spree that had continued for decades across multiple countries. The priest and his followers had moved systematically through northern Mexico and the American Southwest, establishing themselves in remote communities, gaining trust through their legitimate healing abilities, and then eliminating anyone who posed a threat to their secrecy. The final entries in the journal, dated just weeks before the sisters' disappearance, included the names of Dr. Webb, Dr. Chen, Professor Hartley, and Dr. Rivera. Father Sebastian, who had apparently been living in hiding somewhere near Laredo throughout the sisters' 20-year residence, had been monitoring the medical team's investigation and planning their elimination. Dr. Webb survived his poisoning, but barely. Dr. Chen's quick thinking and access to modern medical treatments, combined with Webb's own preparations for this exact scenario, allowed him to recover after several weeks of intensive care. The experience left him physically weakened but mentally sharpened, and he became more determined than ever to see justice done. The investigation revealed that Father Sebastian had died of natural causes sometime in late 1894, leaving the sisters to continue his work alone. His death explained why they had become more careless in their activities, ultimately leading to the scrutiny that exposed their true nature. Without their mentor's guidance, Esperanza and Consuelo had made mistakes that 50 years of careful practice had taught them to avoid. Despite an extensive manhunt involving both American and Mexican authorities, the Valdez sisters were never captured. The investigation did uncover evidence of their escape route, which had taken them south into Mexico and then west toward the Pacific coast. Reports from local authorities suggested they had obtained passage on a ship bound for South America, but these reports were never confirmed. The official government report, filed in the summer of 1895, concluded that Father Sebastian and his followers had been responsible for at least 400 documented murders over a 50-year period. The report estimated that the true number of victims was likely much higher, as many deaths had probably been attributed to natural causes and never investigated as potential homicides. The report also detailed the sophisticated methods used by the cult members, describing them as among the most skilled practitioners of undetectable murder in criminal history. Their combination of legitimate medical knowledge and systematic study of poison and anatomy had made them virtually unstoppable until advancing forensic science and improved communication between law enforcement agencies finally exposed their activities. But the story of the Valdez sisters didn't end with their escape. For years afterward, reports continued to surface throughout Latin America of elderly twin women appearing in remote communities, offering medical services, and displaying the same remarkable preservation that had first attracted Dr. Webb's attention in Laredo. These reports always followed a familiar pattern. The women would arrive quietly in a community suffering from disease or lacking medical care. They would gain trust through their obvious skill and knowledge, establishing themselves as indispensable healers. But inevitably, anyone who asked too many questions about their past or expressed skepticism about their methods would fall victim to mysterious illnesses that defied explanation. Dr. Webb spent the remainder of his career documenting these sightings and working with law enforcement agencies throughout the Americas to track the sisters' movements. His final report on the case, submitted to federal authorities in 1910, concluded that Esperanza and Consuelo were still alive and still practicing their deadly craft in remote areas of South America. What we discovered in Laredo, Webb wrote in his concluding analysis, was not a medical mystery, but a human one. Science could not explain the sisters' longevity because science was looking for natural causes when the truth was far more sinister. These women had learned to extend their own lives by systematically shortening the lives of others. Their apparent immortality was built on a foundation of carefully concealed corpses, and their remarkable preservation was maintained through decades of murder, disguised as medicine. The Valdez case became a landmark in the development of forensic medicine and criminal investigation techniques. Dr. Rivera's analysis of the sisters' methods contributed to early advances in toxicology and the detection of poison-related deaths. Dr. Chen's research into their psychological profiles helped establish some of the first systematic approaches to understanding serial killers and their motivations. Professor Hartley's anthropological work on the Refugio de las Hermanas Commune became a seminal study in the psychology of religious cults and the ways charismatic leaders can corrupt legitimate institutions for criminal purposes. His research helped authorities identify and investigate similar groups throughout the Americas, preventing other tragedies like the one that had produced the Valdez sisters. The case file remained officially open until 1925, when the last confirmed sighting placed two elderly Mexican women in a remote mining town in the Andes Mountains of Peru. Local authorities reported that the women had appeared during a typhoid outbreak, offered their services as healers, and successfully treated dozens of patients before disappearing after several prominent townspeople died under mysterious circumstances. After 1925, the trail went completely cold. Whether the sisters finally succumbed to old age, fell victim to the violence that plagued much of South America during that period, or simply became too skilled at concealment to be detected, remains unknown. But their legacy lived on in the advances in forensic science that their case had helped inspire, and in the cautionary tale their story provided about the corruption of knowledge and skill for evil purposes. Dr. Webb himself was forever changed by his encounter with the Valdez sisters. Colleagues noted that he became obsessed with medical ethics and the responsibility that came with healing knowledge. He spent his later years advocating for strict oversight of medical practice and warning against the dangers of allowing medical knowledge to exist without moral constraints. The adobe house where the sisters had lived became a source of local folklore in Laredo. After their disappearance, the property was sold to a series of owners who attempted to convert it into various businesses: a boarding house, a restaurant, a small hotel. But tenants and customers never stayed long, reporting that the atmosphere felt oppressive and that the carefully tended garden seemed to grow wild herbs and toxic plants that hadn't been planted there. Local residents began to avoid the property, and stories spread about strange smells emanating from the house during certain weather conditions, as if the earth itself retained the chemical residue of decades of poison production. Children were warned to stay away from the area, and even adults felt uneasy when passing the location where so much evil had been concealed behind a facade of healing and charity. By the 1920s, the house had been abandoned entirely, its adobe walls slowly crumbling under the assault of Texas weather and neglect. The garden, once so carefully maintained, grew wild with native plants that seemed to thrive in soil that had been enriched by decades of toxic cultivation. Botanists who studied the area noted that certain poisonous species continued to appear there naturally, as if the genetic material of the sisters' deadly plants had permanently altered the local ecosystem. Today, the site where the Valdez house once stood has been developed into a small commercial district in downtown Laredo. Few residents of the modern city know the dark history of the location, and even fewer realize that they're walking over ground where one of America's most sophisticated serial killing operations was conducted for over 2 decades. The original medical records from Dr. Webb's investigation are stored in the archives of the Texas Rangers, filed under cases that remain technically unsolved due to the perpetrators never being captured or confirmed dead. The documents fill several boxes and represent one of the most comprehensive criminal investigations conducted in the American Southwest during the 1890s. Occasionally, researchers studying the history of frontier medicine or early forensic science discover these records and are amazed by the sophistication of both the crimes and the investigation that exposed them. The case continues to be studied in medical schools as an example of how healing knowledge can be corrupted for criminal purposes, and in law enforcement academies as a demonstration of the importance of inter-agency cooperation in solving complex cases. The question that haunted Dr. Webb until his death in 1932 continues to puzzle researchers and law enforcement officials today. How many other students did Father Sebastian train during his decades of operation? How many other communities throughout the Americas harbored individuals with the knowledge to heal and kill with equal skill? And in our modern world, with its advanced medical technology and global communication networks, could such systematic deception and murder still be possible? Recent advances in DNA analysis and computer-assisted crime pattern recognition have led some researchers to wonder whether the Valdez sisters' methods might be detectable in historical death records that were never properly investigated. Several ongoing projects are using modern forensic techniques to re-examine suspicious death clusters from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, searching for patterns that might indicate the presence of other practitioners of Father Sebastian's deadly arts. The story of Esperanza and Consuelo Valdez serves as a chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are often those who hide behind masks of respectability and service. These women weren't supernatural creatures with mystical powers. They were simply human beings who had been taught that survival justified any action, no matter how horrific, and who had spent decades perfecting the art of murder disguised as medicine. Their apparent longevity wasn't the result of magical knowledge or supernatural intervention. It was the product of systematic elimination of anyone who posed a threat to their secrets. Their remarkable health wasn't maintained through ancient wisdom or special genetics. It was preserved through decades of careful planning, meticulous execution, and the willingness to kill anyone who asked too many questions. Perhaps most disturbing of all, their story demonstrates how easily communities can be deceived by individuals who combine genuine skill with hidden malevolence. The residents of Laredo trusted the sisters because their healing abilities were real and their medical knowledge was extensive. The tragedy wasn't that they were frauds, it was that they were exactly what they appeared to be, but with a horrifying additional dimension that remained hidden until it was almost too late. This mystery shows us that the most dangerous knowledge is that which can be used for both good and evil, and that the greatest evil often wears the mask of the greatest good. The Valdez sisters weren't ancient creatures with mystical powers. They were simply people who had learned that survival sometimes requires choices that civilized society cannot comprehend or forgive. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there might be other secrets still waiting to be uncovered? Leave your comment below and share your theories about what really happened to the sisters after they disappeared. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries that blur the line between medicine and murder. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another dark chapter in American history that science struggled to explain.